Welcome back to the Gentleman Psychic. Let me do the things that I have to do and go right over here and share with all of the social medias. Now, I've been threatening to do this thing where it's supposed to link to everything, and guess what? I haven't. So I have to go back over here. It says I'm live, and then we share this one. Share, copy the link. We'll go over to the Facebook. Let's see. Create a post. Join me live for story time. And we publish that one. And then we go right back over here. Share it here. Okay, and then that is sharing, and then we'll give everyone just a few moments. Hello, Matt. Hello, Christy. Hello again. Congratulations. And Matt, I am doing very well. Good to see you here. I am really excited as we are nearing the end of the Sorrows of Satan. I'm really looking forward to that. So while we're waiting for everyone to show up, hey, cannot stay. Unfortunately, this hospital just want to send you lots of love. Thank you, Raven. I appreciate that. Love to you in your hospital stay. You can watch it afterwards. It will be up on YouTube thereafter. I want to start off by wishing everyone a Native Peoples Day, formerly Columbus Day. It is good that we are acknowledging the Native peoples. I do wish that they were not held on the same day. It is a little bit of a contradiction. Nonetheless, happy Indigenous Peoples Day. That is what I would like to say first and foremost. Secondly, I would like to thank you all for being here. Thank you for all of your likes, your comments, your shares. It means the world to me. It helps me out with the algorithms more than I can say. Okay. Thank you, Christy. Loving my library setup. Thank you very much. I thought that it would be nice to read in this space. So we are going to be, for a while, reading here. That is what we'll be doing. Anyway, my loves, I guess we have four people viewing, and well, I can tell you a little bit. So there are some good things that are coming. There is a mainstream podcast that I should be on coming up this month. I will talk to you a little bit more about it when it is time. And then I want to talk a little bit about, there was a podcast that covered me at the very end, and it was a very right-wing radio. He used a lot of slurs, and I will be doing a video. I responded. I sent him a letter requesting that he would come on my channel. I'll tell you more as it comes to it, but I asked him if he would come on my channel and we could actually sit down and talk like civilized adults. Now, this person I don't expect will be accepting my invitation, because this person is not civilized. Their way of sort of getting laughs and getting attention is to belittle. And also, I went onto his Instagram and I found that he was recently on the Alex Jones show. So that gives you a little bit of information as to what kind of person this being is. Anyway, it's really not important. It's a moot point. And without further ado, I will go ahead and begin the Sorrows of Satan. Oh, I got this brass bell because I liked the sound, and I thought it would be nice to start off with just a little chime. Also, hit that like and subscribe button, ring that notification bell. Keeps you updated, keeps me in your line of sight. Okay. Hello, Angela. Good to see you. Hello, Tori. Good to see you too. Okay, lovelies. Well, without further ado, the sorrows of Satan. We are now on chapter 37. Oh, by the way, for those of you who are just joining, we find out that Sybil has been she's murdered herself, and she has written this long soliloquy about her death and what she faces, and she was just about to reveal who this satanic figure was, and the ink pen was ripped from her hand. So now we continue with chapter 37. I pass all I pass over all the details of polite shock, affected sorrow, and feigned sympathy of society at my wife's sudden death. No one was really grieved about it. Men raised their eyebrows, shrugged their shoulders, lit extra cigarettes, and dismissed the subject as too unpleasant and depressing to dwell upon. Women were glad of the removal of a too beautiful and too much admired rival, and the majority of fashionable folk delighted in having something thrilling to talk about in tragic circumstances of her end. As a rule, people are seldom or never unselfish enough to be honestly sorry for the evanishment of some leading or brilliant figure from their midst. The vacancy leaves room for the pushing in the smaller fry, but sure that if you are unhappily celebrated for either beauty, wit, intellect, or all three together, half society wishes you dead already, and the other half tries to make you as wretched as possible while you are alive. To be missed at all when you die, someone must love you very deeply and unselfishly. And deep, unselfish love is rarer to find among mortals than a pearl in a dustbin. Thanks to my abundance of cash, everything concerning Sybil's suicide was admirably managed. In consideration of her social position as an earl's daughter, two doctors certified, on my paying them a very handsome fee, that hers was a death by misadventure, namely, through taking an accidental overdose of a powerful sleeping draught. It was the best report to make, and the most respectable. It gave the penny press an opportunity of moralizing on the dangers lurked in sleeping draughts generally, and Tom, Dick, and Harry all wrote letters to their favorite periodicals, signing their names in full, giving their opinions as to the nature of sleeping draughts, so that for a week at least, the ordinary dullness of the newspapers was quite enlivened by the unmathematical gratis copy. The conventionalities of law, decency, and order were throughout scrupulously observed and compiled with, everybody was paid, which was the chief thing, and everybody was, I believe, satisfied with what they managed to make out of the death payment. The funeral gave joy to the souls of all the undertakers. It was so expensive and impressive. The florist trade gained something of an impetus by the innumerable orders received for wreaths and crosses made of the costliest flowers. When the coffin was carried to the grave, it could not have been more for the load of the blossoms that covered it. And amid all the cards and loving tokens and farewell, dearests, and not lost but gone before that ticketed to the white masses of lilies, gardenias, and roses, which were supposed to symbolize the innocence and sweetness of the poisoned corpse they were sent to adorn. There was not one honest regret, not one unfeigned expression of true sorrow. Lord Elton made a sufficiently striking figure of dignified parental woe, but on the whole, I think he was not sorry for his daughter's death, since the only opposing obstacle to his marriage with Diana Chesney was now removed. I fancy Diana herself was sorry, so as far as a frivolous little American could be sorry for anything. Perhaps, however, it would be more correct to say that she was frightened. Sybil's sudden end startled and troubled her, and I'm not sure that it grieved her. There is such a difference between unselfish grief and the mere sense of nervous personal shock. Miss Charlotte Fitzroy took the news of her niece's death with that admirable fortitude which frequently characterizes religious spinsters of a certain age. She put by her knitting, said God's will be done, and sent her favorite clergyman. He came, stayed with her some hours drinking strong tea, and the next morning at church administered to her the communion. This done, Miss Fitzroy went on blameless and even tenor of her way, wearing the same virtuously distressed expression as usual, and showed no further sign of feeling. I, as the affected millionaire husband, has no doubt the most interesting figure on the scene. I was, I know, very well got up, thanks to my tailor, and the affectionate care of the chief undertaker who handed me my black gloves on the day of the funeral, with servile solitude. But in my heart I felt myself to be far better actor than Henry Irving, and if only for my admirable mimicry of heartbreak, more fully worthy of accolade. Lucio did not attend the obsequies. He wrote me a brief note of sympathy from town, and hinted that he was sure I could understand his reasons for not being present. I did understand, of course. I appreciated his respect, as I thought, for me my feelings, yet strange and incongruous as it may seem, I never longed so much for his company as I did then. However, we had a glorious burial of my fair and false lady. Prancing horses drew coroneted carriages in long defile down the pretty Warwickshire lanes to the grey old church, picturesque and peaceful, where the clergyman and his assistants in newly washed surplices met the flower-laden coffin, and with the usual conventual mumblings consigned to it, dust to dust. There were even press reporters present, who not only described the scene as I did not happen, but who also sent fancy sketches to their respective journals of the church as it did not exist. I mention this simply to show how thoroughly all proper forms were carried out and conceded to. After the ceremony, all we mourners went back to Willesmere to luncheon, and I well remember that Lord Elton told me a new and risque joke over a glass of port before the meal was finished. The undertakers had a sort of festive banquet in the servants' hall, and taking everything into due consideration, my wife's death gave a great deal of pleasure to many people, and put useful money into several ready pockets. She had left no blank in society that could not be easily filled up. She was merely one butterfly out of thousands, more daintily colored perhaps, and more restless in flight, but never judged as more than up to the butterfly standard. I said no one gave her an honest regret, but I was wrong. Mavis Clare was genuinely, almost passionately grieved. She sent no flowers for the coffin, but she came to the funeral by herself, and stood a little apart, waiting silently till the grave was covered in. And then, just as the fashionable train of mourners were leaving the churchyard, she advanced and placed a white cross of her own garden lilies across the newly turned brown mould. I noticed her action, and determined that before I left Willesmere for the east with Lucio, for my journey had only been postponed a week or two on account of Sybil's death, she should know all. The day came when I carried out this resolve. It was a rainy and chill afternoon, and I found Mavis in her study, sitting beside a bright log fire, with her small terrier in her lap, and her faithful St. Bernard stretched at her feet. She was absorbed in a book, and over her watched the marble palace, inflexible and austere. As I entered, she rose, and putting down the volume and her pet dog together, she advanced to meet me in the intense sympathy in her eyes, in her clear eyes, and a wordless pity in the tremulous lines of her sweet mouth. It was charming to see how sorry she felt for me, and it was odd that I could not feel sorry for myself. After a few words of embraced greeting, I sat down and watched her silently, while she arranged the logs in the fire to make them burn brighter, and for a moment avoided my gaze. I suppose you know, I began with harsh abruptness, "that the sleeping draught story is a polite fiction. You know that my wife poisoned herself intentionally." Mavis looked at me with troubled and compassionate expression. I I feared it was so," she began nervously. "Oh, there is nothing either to fear or to hope," I said with some violence. "She did it. And can you guess why she did it? Because she was mad with her own wickedness and sensuality. Because she loved with a guilty love my friend Lucio Remenes." Mavis gave a little cry as of pain, and sat down white and trembling. "You can read quickly, I am sure," I went on. "Part of the profession of literature is the ability to skim books and manuscripts rapidly and grasp the whole gist of them in a few minutes. Read this." And I handed her the rolled up pages of Sybil's dying declaration. "Let me stay here while you learn from what sort of a woman she was, and judge whether, despite her beauty, she was worth a regret." "Pardon me," said Mavis gently. "I would rather not read what was not meant for my eyes." "But it is meant for your eyes," I retorted impatiently. "It is meant for everybody's eyes, apparently. It is addressed to nobody in particular. There is a mention of you in it. I beg, nay, I command you, read it. I want your opinion on it, your advice. You may possibly suggest, after perusal, the proper sort of epitaph I ought to inscribe on the monument I am going to build to her sacred and dear memory." I covered my face with one hand to hide the bitter smile which I knew betrayed my thoughts, and pushed the manuscript towards her. Very reluctantly, she took it, and slowly unrolling it, began to read. For several minutes there was silence, broken only by the crackling of the logs on the fire and the regular breathing of the dogs, who now both lay stretched comfortably in front of the wood blaze. I looked covertly at the woman whose fame I had envied, at the girlish figure, the coronal of soft hair, the delicate, drooping, sensitive face, the small, white, classic hand that held the written sheets of paper so firmly, yet so tenderly, the very hand of the Greek marble Psyche, and I thought what short-sighted asses some literary men are who suppose they can succeed in shutting out women like Mavis Clare from winning everything that fame or fortune can offer. Such a head as hers, albeit covered with locks fair and caressable, was not meant, in its fine shape and compactness, for submission to inferior intelligences, whether masculine or feminine. That determined little chin, which the firelight delicately outlined, was a visible declaration of strength of will and the indomitably high ambition of its owner. And yet, the soft eyes, the tender mouth, did not these suggest the sweetest love, the purest passion that ever found place in a woman's heart? I lost myself in dreamy musing. I thought of many things that had little to do with either my own past or present. I realized that now and then, at rare intervals, God makes a woman of genius with a thinker's brain and an angel's soul, and that such an one is bound to be a destiny to all mortals less divinely endowed, and a glory to the world in which she dwells. So considering I studied Mavis Clare's face and form, I saw her eyes fill with tears as she read on. Why should she weep? I wondered over that the last document which had left me unmoved and callous. I was startled, almost as if from sleep, when her voice, thrilling with pain, disturbed the stillness. She sprang up, gazing at me, as if she saw some horrible vision. "Oh, are you so blind," she cried, "as to not see what this means? Can you not understand? Do you not know your worst enemy?" "My worst enemy?" I echoed, amazed. "You surprised me, Mavis. What have I, or my enemies, or friends to do with my wife's last confession?" She raved between poison and passion, and could not tell, as you see by her final words, whether she was dead or alive. And her writing at all under such stress of circumstances was a phenomenal effort, but it has nothing to do with me personally. "For God's sake, do not be so hard-hearted," said Mavis passionately. "To me, these last words of Sybil's, poor, tortured, miserable girl, are beyond all expression horrible and appalling. Do you mean to tell me you have no belief in a future life?" "None," I answered with conviction. Then this is nothing to you, this solemn assurance of hers that she is not dead, but living again, living to indescribable misery? You do not believe it? Does anyone believe the ravings of the dying? I answered. She was, as I have said, suffering the torments of poison and passion, and in those torments wrote as one tormented. Is it impossible to convince you of the truth? Asked Mavis solemnly. Are you so diseased in your spiritual perceptions as not to know beyond a doubt that this world is but the shadow of the other world waiting for us? I assure you, as I live, you will have that terrible knowledge forced upon you one day. I am aware of your theories. Your wife had the same beliefs, or rather non-beliefs as yourself, yet she has been convinced at last. I shall not attempt to argue with you. If this last letter of the unhappy girl you wedded cannot open your eyes to the eternal facts you choose to ignore, nothing will ever help you. You are in the power of your enemy. Of whom are you speaking, Mavis? I asked, astonished, observing that she stood like one suddenly appalled in the dream, and her eyes fixed musingly on vacancy, and her lips trembling apart. Your enemy, she repeated with energy. It seems to me as if his shadow stood near you now. Listen to this voice from the dead, Sybil's voice. What does she say? Oh God, have mercy. I know who claims my worship now and drags me into yonder rolling world of flame. His name is... Well, I interrupted eagerly. She breaks off there. His name is... Lucio Jimenez, said Mavis in a thrilling tone. I do not know from whence he came, but I take God to witness my belief that he is the worker of evil, a fiend in beautiful human shape, a destroyer and a corrupter. The curse of him fell on Sybil the moment she met him. The same curse rests on you. Leave him if you are wise. Take your chance of escape while it remains to you, and never let him see your face again. She spoke with a kind of breathless haste, as though impelled by a force not her own. I stared at her, amazed, and in a manner irritated. Such a course of action would be impossible to me, Mavis, I said somewhat coldly. The Prince Jimenez is my best friend. No man ever had a better, and his loyalty to me has been put to a severe test under which most men would have failed. I have not told you all, and I related in a few words the scene I had witnessed between my wife and Lucio in the music gallery at Willowsmere. She listened, but with an evident effort, and pushing back her clustering hair from her brows, she sighed heavily. I am sorry, but it does not alter my conviction, she said. I look upon your best friend as your worst foe, and I feel you do not realize the awful calamity of your wife's death in its true aspect. Will you forgive me if I ask you to leave me now? Lady Sybil's letter has affected me terribly. I feel I cannot speak about it any more. I wish I had not read it. She broke off with a little half-suppressed sob. I saw she was unnerved, and taking the manuscript from her hand, I said half banteringly, You cannot then suggest an epitaph for my wife's monument? She turned upon me with grand gesture of reproach. Yes, I can, she replied in a low, indignant voice. Inscribe it as it is. From a pitiless hand to a broken heart, that will suit the dead girl and you, the living man. Her rustling gown swept across my feet. She passed me and was gone. Stupefied by her sudden anger and equally sudden departure, I stood inert. The St. Bernard rose from the hearthrug and glowered at me suspiciously, evidently wishing me to take my leave. Pallas Athene stared, as usual, through me beyond me in a boundless scorn. All the various objects in this quiet study seemed silently to eject me as an undesired occupant. I looked round it once longingly, as a tired outcast may look on a peaceful garden and wish in vain to enter. How like her sex she is, after all, I said half aloud. She blames me for being pitiless, and forgets that Sybil was the sinner, not I. No matter how guilty a woman may be, she generally manages to secure a certain amount of sympathy. A man is always left out in the cold. A shuddering sense of loneliness oppressed me as my eyes wandered round the restful room. The odor of lilies was in the air, exhaled So I fancied from the delicate and dainty personality of Mavis herself. If I had only known her first and loved her, I murmured as I turned away at last and left the house. But then I remembered I had hated her before I ever met her, and not only had I hated her, but I had vilified and misrepresented her work with a scurrilous pen under the shield of anonymity, and out of sheer malice, thus giving her in the public sight the greatest proof of her own genius a gifted woman can ever win, a man's envy. Chapter 38. 2 weeks later, I stood on the deck of Lucio's yacht, the Flame, a vessel whose complete magnificence filled me as well as the other beholders with bewildered wonderment and admiration. She was a miracle of speed, her motive power being electricity, and the electric engines with which she was fitted were so complex and remarkable as to baffle all would-be inquirers into the secret of their mechanism and potency. A large crowd of spectators gathered to see her as she lay off Southampton, attracted by the beauty of her shape and appearance. Some bolder spirits even came out in tugs and rowboats, hoping to be allowed to make a visit of inspection on board. But the sailors, powerfully built men of a foreign and somewhat unpleasing type, soon intimated that the company of such inquisitive persons was undesirable and unwelcome. With white sails spread and a crimson flag flying from her mast, she weighed anchor at sunset on the afternoon of the day her owner and I joined her, and moving through the waters with delicious noiselessness and incredible rapidity, soon left far behind her the English shore, looking like a white line in the mist, or a pale vision of land might once have been. I had done a few quixotic things before departing from my native country. For example, I had made a free gift of his former home, Willesmere, to Lord Eltham, taking a sort of sullen pleasure in thinking that he, the spendthrift nobleman, owned the restoration of his property to me, who had never been either a successful linen draper or furniture man, but simply an author, one of those sort of people whom my lord and my lady imagine they can patronize, and neglect to gain the pleasure without danger to themselves. The arrogant fools invariably forget what lasting vengeance can be taken for an unmerited slight by the owner of a brilliant pen. I was glad, too, in a way, to realize that the daughter of the American railway king would be brought to the grand old house to air her countessship and look at her prettily pert little physiognomy in the very mirror where Sybil had watched herself die. I do not know why this idea pleased me, for I bore no grudge against Diana Chesney. She was vulgar, but harmless, and would probably make a much more popular chatelaine at Willesmere court than my wife had ever been. Among other things, I dismissed my man Morris, and made him miserable, with the gift of £1,000 to marry and start a business on. He was miserable because he could not make up his mind what business to adopt, his anxiety being to choose the calling that would pay best, and also because though he had his eye upon several young women, he could not tell which among them would be likely the least extravagant and the most serviceable as a cook and housekeeper. The love of money and the pains of taking care of it embittered his days as it embitters the days of most men, and my unexpected munificence towards him burdened him with such a weight of trouble as robbed him of a natural sleep and appetite. I cared nothing for his perplexities, however, and gave him no advice, good or bad. My other servants I dismissed, each with a considerable gift of money, not that I particularly wished to benefit them, but simply because I desired them to speak well of me. And in this world, it is very evident that the only way to get a good opinion is to pay for it. I gave orders to a famous Italian sculptor for Sybil's monument. English sculptors have no conception of sculpture. It was to be of exquisite design, wrought in purest white marble, the chief adornment being the center figure of an angel, ready for flight, with the face of Sybil faithfully copied from her picture. Because, however, devilish a woman may be in her lifetime, one is bound by all laws of social hypocrisy to make an angel of her as soon as she is dead. Just before I left London, I heard that my old friend, Buffles, John Carrington, had met with a sudden end. Busy at the restoring of his gold, he had been choked by the mercurial fumes and had died in hideous torment. At one time, this news would have deeply affected me, but now I was scarcely sorry. I had heard nothing of him since I had come into my fortune. He had never even written to congratulate me. Always full of my own self-importance, I judged this as a great neglect on his part. And now that he was dead, I felt no more than any of the rest of us feel nowadays at the loss of friends. And that is very little. We have really no time to be sorry. So many people are always dying, and we are in such desperate hurry to rush on the death of ourselves. Nothing seemed to touch me that did not closely concern my own personal interest, and I had no affections left, unless I may call the vague tenderness I had for Mavis Clare an affection. Yet, to be honest, this very emotion was, after all, nothing but a desire to be consoled, pitied, and loved by her, to be able to turn upon the world and say, "This woman whom you have lifted on your shield of honor and crowned with laurels, she loves me. She is not yours, but mine." Purely interested and purely selfish was the longing, and it deserved no other name than selfishness. My feelings for Ramirez, too, began at this time to undergo a curious change. The fascination I had for him, the power he exercised over me, remained as great as ever, but I found myself often absorbed in close study of him, strangely against my own will. Sometimes his every look seemed fraught with meaning, his every gesture suggestive of an almost terrific authority. He was always to me the most attractive of beings. Nevertheless, there was an uneasy sensation of doubt and fear growing up in my mind regarding him, a painful anxiety to know more about him than he had ever told me, and on rare occasions I experienced a sudden shock of inexplicable repulsion against him, which, like a tremendous wave, threw me back with violence upon myself, and left me half stunned, with a dread of I knew not what. Alone with him, as it were, on the wild sea, cut off for a long time from all other intercourse than that which we shared together. These sensations were very strong upon me. I began to note many things which I had been too blind or too absorbed in my own pursuits to observe before. The offensive presence of Mil, who acted as chief steward on board the yacht, filled me now not only with dislike, but nervous apprehension. The dark and more or less repulsive visages of the crew haunted me in my dreams, and one day, leaning over the vessel's edge and gazing blankly down into the fathomless water below, I fell to thinking of strange sorceries of the East and stories of magicians who, by the exercise of unlawful science, did to make victims of men and delude them at their wills that their wills were entirely perverted and no longer their own. I do not know why this passing thought should have suddenly overwhelmed me with deep depression, but when I looked up, to me the sky had grown dark, and the face of one of the sailors who was near me polishing the brass handrail seemed singularly threatening and sinister. I moved to go to the other side of the deck when a hand was gently laid on my shoulder from behind, and turning, I met the sad and splendid eyes of Lucio. "Are you growing weary of the voyage, Geoffrey?" he asked. "Weary of those two suggestions of eternity? The interminable sky, the interminable sea? I'm afraid you are. Man easily gets fatigued with his own littleness and powerlessness when he is set afloat on a plank between air and ocean. Yet we are traveling as swiftly as electricity will bear us, and as worked in the vessel, it is carrying us at far greater speed than perhaps you realize or imagine." I made no immediate answer, but taking his arm, strolled slowly up and down. I felt he was looking at me, but I avoided meeting his gaze. "You have been thinking of your wife?" he queried softly, and as I thought sympathetically. "I have shunned, for the reasons you know of, all allusion to the tragic end of a beautiful creature. Beauty is, alas, so often the subject of hysteria. Yet, if you had any faith, you would believe she is an angel now. I stopped short at this and looked straight at him. There was a fine smile on his delicate mouth. An angel, I repeated slowly, or a devil? Which would you say she is? You who sometimes declare that you believe in heaven and hell. He was silent, but the dreamy smile remained still on his lips. Come, speak, I said roughly. Come, speak, I said roughly. You can be frank with me, you know, angel or devil, which? My dear Geoffrey, he remonstrated gently and with gravity, a woman is always an angel, both here and hereafter. I laughed bitterly. If that is part of your faith, I am sorry for you. I have not spoken of my faith, he rejoined in colder accents, lifting his brilliant eyes to the darkening heaven. I am not a salvationist, that I should bray forth a creed to the sound of a trump and drum. All the same, you have a creed, I persisted, and I fancy it must be a strange one. If you remember, you promised to explain it to me. Are you ready to receive such an explanation? He asked in somewhat ironical tone. No, my dear friend, permit me to say you are not ready, not yet. My beliefs are too positive to be brought even into contact with your contradictions, too frighteningly real to submit your doubts for a moment. You would at once begin to revert to the punny used up old arguments of Voltaire, Schopenhauer, and Huxley, little atomic theories like grains of dust in the whirlwind of my knowledge. I can tell you I believe in God as a very actual and positive being, and that is presumably the first of the church articles. You believe in God? I echoed his words, staring at him stupidly. He seemed in earnest. The fact he had always seemed in earnest on the subject of deity. Vaguely I thought of a woman in society whom I slightly knew, an ugly woman, unattractive and mean-minded, who passed her time entertaining the semi-royalties and pushing herself amongst them. She had said to me one day, I hate people who believe in God, don't you? The idea of God makes me sick. You believe in God? I repeated again dubiously. Look, he said, raising his hand towards the sky. There's a few drifting clouds cover millions of the worlds, impenetrable, mysterious, yet actual. Down there, and he pointed to the sea, lurk 1,000 things of which, though the ocean is a part of Earth, human beings have not yet learned the nature. Between these upper and lower spaces of the incomprehensible, yet absolute, you, a finite atom of limited capability, stand, uncertain how long the frail thread of your life shall last, yet arrogantly balancing the question with your own poor brain as to whether you, in your utter littleness and incompetency, shall condescend to accept a God or not. I confess that of all astonishing things in the universe, this particular attitude of modern mankind is the most astonishing to me. Your own attitude is the reluctant acceptance of such terrific knowledge as is forced upon me, he replied with a dark smile. I do not say I have been an apt or willing pupil. I have had to suffer in learning what I know. Do you believe in hell? I asked him suddenly, and in Satan, the arch enemy of mankind? He was silent for a long time, that I was surprised. The more so as he grew pale to the lips, and a curious, almost death-like rigidity of feature gave his expression something of the ghastly and terrible. After a pause, he turned his eyes upon me. An intense burning misery was reflected in them, though he smiled. Most assuredly, I believe in hell. How can I do otherwise if I believe in heaven? If there is an up there, must there be a down? If there is light, must there also be darkness? And concerning the arch enemy of mankind, if half the stories reported of him are true, he must be the most piteous and pitiable figure in the universe. What would be the sorrows of 1,000 million worlds compared to the sorrows of Satan? Sorrows, I echoed. He is supposed to rejoice in the working of evil. Neither angel nor devil can do that. he said slowly. To rejoice in the working of evil is a temporary mania which affects man only. For actual joy to come out of evil, chaos must come again, and God must extinguish himself. He stared across the dark sea. The sun had sunk, and one faint star twinkled through the clouds. And so I again say, the sorrows of Satan, sorrows immeasurable as an eternity itself imagined them, to be shut out of heaven, to hear all through the unending aeons the far-off voices of angels whom once he knew and loved, to be a wanderer among deserts of darkness, and to pine for the light celestial that was formerly as air and food to his being, and to know that man's folly, man's utter selfishness, man's cruelty, keep him thus exiled, an outcast from pardon and peace. Man's nobleness may lift the lost spirit almost within reach of his lost joys, but man's vileness drags him down. Easy was the torture of Sisyphus compared with the torture of Satan. No wonder that he loathes mankind. Small blame to him if he seeks to destroy the puny tribe eternally. Little marvel that he grudges them their share of immortality. Think of it as a legend merely. And he turned upon me with a movement that was almost fierce. Shrieked, redeemed man. Oh, sorry. It was Christ. It was Christ redeemed man, and by his teaching showed how it was possible for man to redeem the devil. I do not understand you, I said feebly, awed by the strange pain and passion of his tone. Do you not? Yet my meaning is scarcely obscure. If men were true to their immortal instincts and to the God that made them, if there were generous, honest, fearless, faithful, reverent, unselfish, if women were pure, brave, tender, and loving, you could not imagine that. In the strong force and fairness of such a world, Lucifer, son of the morning, would be moved to love instead of hate, that the closed doors of paradise would be unbarred, and that he lifted towards his Creator own prayers of pure lives, which would wear again his angel's crown? Can you not realize this, even by way of legendary story? Why, yes, as a legendary story, the idea is beautiful, I admitted, and to me, as I told you once before, quite new. Still, as men are never likely to be honest or women pure, I'm afraid the poor devil stands a bad chance of ever getting redeemed. I fear so too, and he eyed me with a curious derision. I very much fear so, and his chances of being so slight, I rather respect him for being the arch enemy of such a worthless race. He paused a moment, then added, I wonder how we have managed to get on such an absurd subject of conversation. It is dull and uninteresting, as all spiritual themes invariably are. My object in bringing you out of this voyage is not to indulge in psychological argument, but to make you forget your troubles as much as possible and enjoy the present while it lasts. There was a vibration of compassionate kindness in this voice, which at once moved me to an acute sense of self-pity. The worst innervator of moral force that exists, I sighed heavily. Truly, I have suffered, I said, more than most men. More even than most millionaires deserve to suffer, declared Lucio, with that inevitable touch of sarcasm which distinguished some of his friendliest remarks. Money is supposed to make amends to a man for everything. And even the wealthy wife of a certain Irish patriot has not found it incompatible with affection to hold her money bags close to herself, while her husband has been declared a bankrupt. How she idolized him. Let others say, now considering your cash abundance, it must be owned the fates that have treated you somewhat unkindly. The smile that was half cruel and half sweet radiated in his eyes as he spoke. And again, a singular revulsion of feeling against him moved me to dislike and fear. And yet, how fascinating was his company! I could not but admit that the voyage with him to Alexandria on board the Flame was one of the positive enchantment and luxury all the way. There was nothing in material sense left to wish for. All that could appeal to the intelligence or the imagination had been brought on board this wonderful yacht, which sped like a fairy ship over the sea. Some of the sailors were skilled musicians, and on tranquil nights or at sunset would bring stringed instruments and discourse to our ears in the most dulcet and ravishing melodies. Lucio himself, too, would often sing, his luscious voice resounding, as it seemed, over all the visible sea and the sky, with such passion as might have drawn an angel down to listen. Gradually, my mind became impregnated with these snatches of mournful, fierce, or weird minor tunes, and I began to suffer in silence from the inexplicable depression and foreboding sense of misery, as well as from another terrible feeling to which I could scarcely give a name, a dreadful uncertainty of myself, as one of the most as one lost in the wilderness and about to die. I endured these fits of mental agony alone, and in such dreary burning moments believed I was going mad. I grew more and more sullen and taciturn, and when we at last arrived at Alexandria, I was not moved to any particular pleasure. The place was new to me, but I was not conscious of novelty. Everything seemed flat, dull, and totally uninteresting. A heavy, almost lethargic stupor chained my wits, and when we left the yacht in the harbor and went on to Cairo, I was not sensible of my personal enjoyment in the journey, or interest in what I saw. I was only partially roused when we took possession of a luxurious deba, which, with a retinue of attendants, had been specially chartered for us, and commenced our lotus like voyage up the Nile. The reed edged, sluggish yellow river fascinated me. I used to spend long hours reclining at full length on the deck chair, gazing at the flat shores, the brown sand heaps, the broken columns and mutilated temples of the dead kingdoms of the past. One evening, thus musing, while the great golden moon climbed languidly up into the sky to stare at the wrecks of earthly ages, I said, if one could only see these ancient cities as they once existed, what strange revelations might be made. Our modern marvels of civilization and progress might seem well trifles after all. For I believe in our days we are only rediscovering what the peoples of old time knew. Lucio drew his cigar from his mouth and looked at it meditatively. Then he glanced up at me with half a smile. Would you like to see a city resurrected? He inquired. Here, in this very spot, some 6,000 years ago, a king reigned with a woman, not his queen, but his favourite, quite a lawful arrangement in those days, who was as famous for her beauty and virtue as this river is for fructifying tide. Here, civilization had progressed enormously, with the one exception that it had not outgrown faith. Modern France and England had beaten the ancients in their scorn of God and creed, their contempt for divine things, their unnamable lasciviousness and blasphemy. This city, and he waved his hand towards the dreary stretch of shore, where a cluster of tall reeds waved above the monster fragment of the fallen column, was governed by the strong, pure faith of its people more than anything, and the ruler of social things in it was a woman. The king's favorite was something like Mavis Clare, in that she possessed genius. She had also the qualities of justice, intelligence, love, truth, and most noble, unselfishness. She made this place happy. It was a paradise on earth while she lived. When she died, its glory ended. So much can a woman do if she chooses. So much does she not do in her usual cow-like way of living. How do you know all this you tell me of? I asked him. By study of past records, he replied. I read what modern men declare they have no time to read. You are right in the idea that all new things are only old things reinvented or rediscovered. If you had gone a step further and said that some of men's present lives are only the continuation of their past, you would not have been wrong. Now, if you like, I can, by my science, show you the city that stood here long ago. The city beautiful, as its name is translated from the ancient tongue. I roused myself from my longing attitude and looked at him amazedly. He met my gaze unmoved. You can show it to me? I exclaimed. How can you do such an impossible thing? Permit me to hypnotize you, he answered, smiling. My system of hypnotism is, very fortunately, not yet discovered by meddlesome inquirers into occult matters, but it never fails of its effect, and I promise you, you shall, under my influence, see not only the place but the people. My curiosity was strongly excited, and I became more eager to try the suggested experiment than I cared to openly show. I laughed, however, with affected indifference. I'm perfectly willing, I said. All the same, I don't think you can hypnotize me. I have much too strong a will of my own, at which remark I saw a smile, dark and saturnine, hover on his lips. But you can make the attempt. He rose at once and signed to the Egyptian servants. Stop the Deva, Asma, he said. We will rest here for the night. Azima, a superb-looking Eastern in the picturesque white garments, put his hands to the head in submission, and retired to give the order. In another few moments, the Deva had stopped. A great silence was around us. The moonlight fell like yellow wine on the deck. In the far distance, across the stretches of dark sand, a solitary column towered so clearly cut against the sky that it was almost possible to discern upon it the outline of monstrous face. Lucio stood still, confronting me, saying nothing, but looking me steadily through and through, with those wonderfully mystic, melancholy eyes that seemed to penetrate and burn my very flesh. I was attracted as a bird might be to the basilisk eyes of a snake. Yet I tried to smile and say something indifferent. My efforts were useless. Personal consciousness was slipping from me fast. The sky, the water, the moon whirled around each other in giddy chase of precedence. I could not move, for my limbs seemed fastened to my chair with weights of iron, and I was for a few minutes absolutely powerless. Then suddenly my vision cleared, as I thought, my senses grew vigorous and alert. I heard the sound of solemn marching music, and there in the full radiance of the moon, with 1,000 lights gleaming from the towers and cupolas, shone the city beautiful. Chapter 39. A vision of majestic buildings, vast, stately, and gigantic, of streets crowded with men and women in white and colored garments, adorned with jewels, of flowers that grew on the roofs of palaces and swung from terrace to terrace in loops and garlands of fantastic bloom, of trees, broad-branched and fully leafed, of marble embankments overlooking the river, of lotus lilies growing thickly below by the water's edge, of music that echoed in silver and brazen twangings from the shelter of shady gardens and covered balconies. Every beautiful detail rose before me more distinctly than an ivory carving mounted on an ebony shield. Just opposite where I stood, or seemed to stand, on the deck of a vessel in the busy harbor, a wide avenue extended, opening up into huge squares embellished with strange figures of granite gods and animals. I saw the sparkling spray of many fountains in the moonlight, and heard the low, persistent hum of the restless human multitudes that thronged the place as quickly as bees clustered in a hive. To the left of the scene, I could discern a huge bronze gate guarded by sphinxes. There was a garden beyond it, and from that depth of shade, a girl's voice singing a strange, wild melody came floating towards me on the breeze. Meanwhile, the marching music I had first of all caught the echo of sounded nearer and nearer, and presently I perceived a great crowd approaching with lighted torches and garlands of flowers. Soon I saw a band of priests in brilliant robes that literally blazed with sun-like gems. They were moving toward the river, and with them came young boys and little children, while on the other side, maidens white-veiled and rose-wreathed paced demurely, swinging silver censers to and fro. After the priestly procession walked a regal figure between the ranks of slaves and attendants. I knew it for the king of this city, beautiful, and was almost moved to join in the thundering acclamations which greeted his progress. And the snowy palanquin, carried by lily-crowned girls, that followed his train. Who occupied it? What gem of his land was thus tenderly enshrined? I was consumed by the extraordinary longing to know this. I watched the white burden coming nearer to my point of vantage. I saw the priests arrange themselves in a semicircle on the river embankment, the king in their midst, and the surging, shouting multitude around. Then came the brazen clangor of many bells, intermixed with the rolling of drums and the shrilling sound of reed pipes blown upon, and amid the blaze of flaring torches, the white palanquin was sat down upon the ground. A woman, clad in some silvery glistening tissue, stepped forth from it like a sylph from the foam of the sea. But she was veiled. I could not discern so much as the outline of her features, and the keen disappointment of this was a positive torture to me. If I could but see her, I thought, I should know something I had never hitherto guessed. Lift, oh, lift the shrouding veil, spirit of the city beautiful, I inwardly prayed, for I feel I shall read in your eyes the secret of happiness. But the veil was not withdrawn. The music made barbaric clamor in my ears. The blaze of strong light and color blinded me, and I felt myself reeling into a dark chaos where, as I imagined, I chased the moon as she flew before me on silver wings. Then, the sound of a rich baritone trolling out a light song from a familiar modern opera bouffe confused and startled me, and in another second I found myself staring wildly at Lucio, who, lying easily back in his deck chair, was caroling joyously to the silent night and the blank expanse of sandy shore, in front of which our deba rested motionless. With a cry, I flung myself upon him. "Where is she?" I exclaimed. "Who is she?" He looked at me without replying, and smiling quizzically, released himself from the sudden grasp. I drew back, shuddering and bewildered. "I saw it all," I murmured. "The city, the priests, the people, the king, all but her face. Why was that hidden from me?" And actual tears rose to my eyes involuntarily. Lucio surveyed me with evident amusement. "What a find you would be to the first-class spiritual impostor, playing his tricks in cultured and easily gulled London society," he observed. "You seem most powerfully impressed by a passing vision." "Do you mean to tell me," I said earnestly, "that what I just saw just now was the mere thought of your brain conveyed to mine?" "Precisely," he responded. "I know what the city beautiful was like, and I was able to draw it for you on the canvas of my memory and present it as a complete picture to your inward sight. You have an inward sight, though, like most people, you live unconscious of that neglected faculty." "But who was she?" I repeated obstinately. "She was, I presume, the king's favourite. If she kept her face hidden from you, as you complain, I am sorry, but I assure you that it was not my fault. Get to bed, Geoffrey. You looked dazed. You take visions badly, yet they are better than realities, believe me." Somehow I could not answer him. I left him abruptly and went below to try to sleep. My thoughts were all cruelly confused, and I began to be more than ever overwhelmed with a sense of deepening terror, a feeling that I was being commanded, controlled, and, as it were, driven along by force that had in it something unearthly. It was a most distressing sensation. It made me shrink at times from the look of Lucio's eyes. Now and then, indeed, I almost cowered before him, so increasingly great was the indefinable dread I had on his presence. It was not so much the strange vision of the city beautiful that had inspired this in me, for after all, that was only a trick of hypnotism, as he had said, and as I was content to argue it with myself. But it was his whole manner that suddenly began to impress me as it had never impressed me before. If any change was slowly taking place in my sentiments towards him, so surely it seemed was the changing equally towards me. His imperious ways were more imperial, his sarcasm more sarcastic, his contempt for mankind more openly displayed and more frequently pronounced, yet I admired him as much as ever. I delighted in his conversation, whether it were witty, philosophical, or cynical. I could not imagine myself without his company. Nevertheless, the gloom on my mind deepened. Our Nile trip became infinitely wearisome to me. so much so that almost before we had got the halfway on our journey upriver, I longed to turn back again and wished the voyage at an end. An incident that occurred at Luxor was more than sufficient to strengthen this desire. We had stayed there for several days, exploring the district and visiting the ruins of Thebes and Karnak, where they were busy excavating tombs. One afternoon, they brought to light a red granite sarcophagus intact. In it, which was richly painted coffin, which was opened in our presence, and was found to contain the elaborately adorned mummy of a woman. Lucio proved himself an apt reader of hieroglyphs, and he translated in brief, with a glib accuracy, the history of the corpse, as it was pictured inside the sepulchral shell. A dancer at the court of Queen Amenartis, he announced, for the benefit of several interested spectators with whom myself stood round the sarcophagus, who, because of her many sins and secret guilt, which made her life unbearable, and her days full of corruption, died of poison administered by her own hand, according to the king's command, and in presence of the executioner's law. Such is the lady's story, condensed. There are a good many other details, of course. She appears to have been only in her 20th year. Well, he smiled as he looked around upon all his little audience, we may congratulate ourselves on having progressed since the days of these overstrict ancient Egyptians. The sins of dancers are not with us. Taken our Grand Siru. Shall we see what she is like? No objection was raised by the authorities concerned in the discoveries, and I, who had never witnessed the unrolling of a mummy before, watched the process with great interest and curiosity. As one by one of the scented wrappings were removed, the long stress of nut-brown hair became visible. Then those two were engaged in task used more extreme and delicate precaution, Lucio himself assisting them to uncover the face. As thus was done, a kind of sick horror stole over me, brown and stiff as parchment. Though the features were, their contour was recognizable. And when the whole countenance was exposed to view, I could almost have shrieked aloud the name of Sybil, for it was like her, dreadfully like her, and as the faint, half-aromatic, half-putrid odors of the unrolled excrements crept towards me on the air, I reeled back giddily and covered my eyes. Irresistibly, I was reminded of the subtle French parfum exhaled from Sybil's garments when I found her dead. That and the sickly effluvia were not unalike. A man standing near me saw me swerve as though about to fall and caught me on his arm. The sun is too strong for you, I fear, he said kindly. This climate does not suit everybody. I forced a smile and murmured something about passing a touch of vertigo. Then, recovering myself, I gazed fearfully at Lucio, who was studying the mummy attentively, with a curious smile. Presently, stooping over the coffin, he took out of it a piece of finely wrought gold in the shape of a medallion. This, I imagine, must be the fair dancer's portrait, he said, holding it up to the view of all eager and examining spectators. Quite a treasure trove, an admirable piece of ancient workmanship, besides being the picture of a very lovely woman. Do you not think so, Geoffrey? He handed me the medallion, and I examined it with deadly and fascinated interest. The face was exquisitely beautiful, but assuredly it was the face of Sybil. I never remember how I lived through the rest of the day. At night, as soon as I had an opportunity of speaking to Jimenez alone, I asked him, "Did you see? Did you not recognize? The dead Egyptian dancer resembling your late wife?" He quietly continued. "Oh, yes, I noticed it at once, but that should not affect you. History repeats itself. Why should not a lovely woman repeat themselves? Beauty always has its double somewhere, either in past or future." I said no more. But next morning I was very ill, so ill that I could not rise from my bed, and passed the hours in restless moaning and irritable pain that was not so much physical as mental. There was a physician resident at the Hotel Luxor, and Lucio, always showing himself particularly considerate for my personal comfort, sent for him at once. He felt my pulse, shook his head, and after much dubious pondering, advised my leaving Egypt immediately. I heard his mandate given with a joy I could scarcely conceal. The yearning I had to get quickly away from this land of the old gods was intense and feverish. I loathed the vast, awful desert silences, where the Sphinx frowns contempt on the puny littleness of mankind, where the open tombs and coffins exposed once more to the light of day faces that are very semblances of those we ourselves have known and loved in our time, and where painted history tells us of just such things as our modern newspapers chronicles, albeit in different form. Jimenez was ready and willing to carry out the doctor's orders and arranged our return to Cairo, and from thence to Alexandria, with such expedition as left me nothing to desire, and filled me with gratitude for his apparent sympathy. In as short a time as abundance of cash could make possible, we had rejoined the Flame, and were en route, as I thought, for France or England, and had not absolutely settled our destination, having some idea of coasting along the Riviera. But my old confidence in Jimenez being now almost restored, I left this to him for decision, sufficiently satisfied in myself that I had not been destined to leave my bones in terror-haunted Egypt, and it was not till I had been about a week or 10 days on board, and had made good progress in recovery of my health, that the beginning of the end of this never-to-be-forgotten voyage was foreshadowed to me in such terrific fashion as nearly plunged me into the darkness of death, or rather, let me now saying, having learned my bitter lesson thoroughly, into the fell brilliancy of that life beyond the tomb, which we refuse to recognize or realize till we are whirled into its glorious or awful vortex. One evening, after a bright day of swift and enjoyable sailing over smooth and sunlit sea, I retired to rest in my cabin, feeling almost happy. My mind was perfectly tranquil. My trust in my friend Lucio was again reestablished, and I may add, so is my old arrogant and confident trust in myself. Excuse me. My access to fortune had not so far. One moment, please. Excuse me. My access to fortune had not so far brought me either much joy or distinction. But it was not too late for me yet to pluck the golden apples of Hesperides. The various troubles I had endured, though of such recent occurrence, began to assume a blurred indistinctness in my mind, as of things long past and done with. I considered the strength of my financial position again with satisfaction, to the extent of my contemplating a second marriage, and that marriage with Mavis Clare. No other woman should be my wife, I mentally swore. She, and she only, should be mine. I foresaw no difficulties in the way, and full of pleasant dreams and self-delusions, I settled myself in my berth, and dropped easily off to sleep. About midnight, I awoke vaguely terrified, to see the cabin full of strong red light and fierce glare. My first dazed impression was that the yacht was on fire. The next instant, I became paralyzed and dumb with horror. Sybil stood before me. Sybil, a wild, strange, tortured, writhing figure, half nude, waving, beckoning arms, and making desperate gestures. Her face, as I had seen it in the last death, livid and hideous, her eyes blazed, mingled menace, despair, and warning upon me. Round her a living wreath of flame coiled upwards like a twisted snake. Her lips moved as though she strove to speak, but no sound came from them, and while I yet looked at her, she vanished. I must have lost consciousness then, for when I awoke it was broad day. But this ghastly visitation was only the first of many such, and at last every night I saw her thus, sheeted in flame, till I grew well nigh mad with fear and misery. My torment was indescribable, yet I said nothing to Lucio, who watched me, as I imagined, narrowly. I took sleeping draughts in the hope to procure unbroken rest, but in vain. Always I woke at one particular moment, and always I had to face this fiery phantom of my dead wife, with despair in her eyes and an uttered warning on her lips. This was not all. One day, in the full sunlight of quiet afternoon, I entered the saloon of the yacht alone and started back amazed to see my old friend John Carrington seated at the table, pen in hand. Casting up accounts, he bent over his papers closely. His face was furrowed and very pale, but so lifelike was he, so seemingly substantial, that I called him by name, whereat he looked up, smiled drearily, and was gone. Trembling in every limb, I realized that here was another spectral terror added to the burden of my days, and sitting down, I tried to rally my scattered forces and reason out what was the best to be done. There was no doubt I was very ill. These phantoms were the warning of a brain disease. I must endeavor, I thought, to keep myself well under control till I got to England. There I determined to consult the best physicians and put myself under their care till I was thoroughly restored. Meanwhile, I muttered to myself, I will say nothing, not even to Lucio. He would only smile, and I should hate him. I broke off, wondering at this, for it was possible I should ever hate him. Surely not. That night, by way of change, I slept in a hammock on the deck, hoping to dispel midnight illusions by resting in the open air. But my sufferings were only intensified. I woke, as usual, to see not only Sybil, but also my deadly fear of the three dark phantoms that had appeared to me in my room in London on the evening of Viscount Linton's suicide. There they were, the same, the very same, only this time all their livid faces were lifted and turned towards me, and though their lips never moved, the word misery seemed uttered for I heard it tolling like a funeral bell in the air and across the sea. And Sybil, with a face of death in the coils of silent flame, Sybil smiled at me, a smile of torture and remorse. God, I could endure it no longer. Leaping from my hammock, I ran toward the vessel's edge. One plunge into the cool waves. Ah, there stood Amiel with his impenetrable dark face and ferret eyes. Can I assist you, sir? He inquired deferentially. I stared at him, then burst into a laugh. Assist me? No, you can do nothing. I want rest, and I cannot sleep here. The air is too close, and the very stars are burning hot. I paused. He regarded me with his usual gravely derisive expression. I am going down to my cabin, I continued, trying to speak more calmly. I shall be alone there, perhaps. Again I laughed wildly and involuntarily, and staggered away from him down the deck stairs, afraid to look back, lest I should see those three dead figures of fate following me. Once safe in my cabin, I shut the door violently, and in feverish haste seized my case of pistols. I took out one, loaded it. My heart was beating furiously. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, lest they should encounter the dead eyes of Sybil. One click of the trigger, I whispered, and it's all over. I shall be at peace, senseless, sightless, and painless. Horrors can no longer haunt me. I shall sleep. I raised the weapon steadily to my right temple, when suddenly my cabin door opened, and Lucio looked in. Pardon me, he said, as he observed my attitude. I had no idea you were busy. I will go away. I would not like to disturb you for the world. His smile had something fiendish in its fine mockery. Moved with a quick revulsion of feeling, I turned the pistol downwards and held its muzzle firmly against the table near me. You say that, I exclaimed in acute anguish. You say it, seeing me thus? I thought you were my friend. You looked full at me. His eyes grew large and luminous with splendor of scorn. Passion and sorrow intermingled. Did you? And again the terrific smile lit up in his pale features. You were mistaken. I am your enemy. A dreadful silence followed. Something lurid and unearthly in his expression appalled me. I trembled and grew cold with fear. Mechanically, I replaced the pistol in its case. Then I gazed up at him with vacant wonder and wild piteousness, seeing that his dark and frowning figure seemed to increase in stature. Towering above me like the gigantic shadow of a storm cloud, my blood froze with an unnameable sickening terror. Then thick darkness veiled my sight, and I dropped down senseless. One moment. I thought we were going to finish that. We are on 441. No. I think there's one more chapter. We have one more chapter. We will read that next week. All right, my lovelies. Thank you for joining me. Remember to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Also, my lovelies, if you are enjoying this channel, if it gives you any amount of value, I appreciate it. If you can, and only if it is not an imposition, do consider joining me on Patreon. It can help to continue to produce such great entertainment as you see here. And also, you can find me on patreon.com/thegentlemanpsychic. You can find me on PayPal at rlillard6@gmail.com and on Venmo at Richard-Lale Lillard. Richard is capital, Lale is capital, Lillard is capital. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining me. Yes, we've got 9 people I saw, 6 now. Thank you everyone. Good evening. I hope you enjoyed it. Much love to you. Take care. Good night.